Welcome to the next video where we look at Chapter 13 Alpha, learning the imperfect tense. So let's go back to our previous discussion of tense versus aspect. First, we'll talk about these examples in English using the English indicative. So here's my chart that you've seen before. We're going to look at simple versus progressive and present tense versus past tense. So the English present tense verb with simple aspect is I leave. Present tense with progressive ongoing aspect is I am leaving. We might call this the present progressive in English. Simple past tense, I left, and progressive past tense, I was leaving. We call this one the imperfect in English as well as Greek. So now let's look at the Greek indicative. As I've mentioned before, the Greek indicative does not distinguish between simple present and present progressive, so both I leave and I am leaving are lepo. But in the past, it distinguishes between the simple past and the progressive past. So for the simple past, you use the aorist, elepon, I left, and for the past progressive, you use the imperfect, elepon. So to recap, in Greek, no distinction between simple present and present progressive, but the simple past uses aorist and the past progressive uses imperfect. So in this video, we'll look at how to form the imperfect. You'll notice that both of them start with the augment, but the crucial difference is that the aorist uses the aorist stem, which you take from the third principal part in the dictionary, and the imperfect uses the present stem, which you take from the first principal part. Both of them use a set of endings, which happen to look the same in this slide, and I will talk more about them in the next slide. They won't always look the same. Just so you know, the imperfect only exists in the indicative, so we don't have to talk about participles, imperatives, or infinitives. Okay, so now let's talk about the endings. As I said, it only exists in the indicative. So for the indicative, you take the augment plus the present stem plus a set of endings. The active endings are on, s, e, omen, eta, on, which you learned recently when you learned the second aorist. And the middle endings are omen, eso, which contracts to u, eto, ometa, este, onto. Again, you learned those when you learned the second aorist. So let's use a sample verb, lepo, lepso, elepon. Form the imperfect by taking the augment, epsilon, plus the present stem, which we get from the first principal part, lep, and then I'm going to pick the active, so active endings, elepon, I was leaving. In contrast, let's talk about the aorist. So you'll recall that the aorist, some verbs use the first set of endings on s, e, and other verbs use the second set of endings sa, se. The first set on s, e was called the thematic, and the second set sa, was called the sigmatic. They're also called the second aorist and the first aorist. So elepon happens to be a thematic second aorist because we know that by looking at the third principal part to see which one that word uses. So if we take the augment again, e, plus the aorist stem, lip, plus we know from the third principal part that this particular verb uses on, s, e. So elepon is I left versus elepon, I was leaving. So let's look at one example of a different verb that uses the sa, se endings. So I'm going to use luo, luso, elusa. Form the imperfect, e, present stem, lu, and then again I'm going to pick an active one, imperfect. All the imperfects use on, s, e, and omen, u, eto. There's no sa, se in the imperfect. So I'm going to make this active. Elu on, I was loosening. Contrast with the aorist, the augment, plus the aorist stem, which here is also lu, plus we know from the third principal part that this particular verb uses the sa, sas, sa, and se endings. So, loose, sa, I loosened. So, in the example of the verb lepo, lepso, elipon, the only difference between imperfect and aorist is the stem in the middle, elepon versus elipon. And then in the second verb, luo, luso, elusa, the only difference between the imperfect and the aorist is the endings. The on, s, endings are for imperfect, and the sa, se endings are for aorist. That's it for now. I will see you next time in Chapter 13 Beta.